the unit is organization and reorganization of human societies. An easier way to understand it is it's an era of more classical civilizations, right? So this is the unit where you're going to learn about the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, and then we're going to, kind of dive deeper into Buddhism and Confucianism and some of the, again, the early Chinese dynasties. So it's not modern history yet by any means. So let's start. Let's start the lecture. We're going to start with chapter 3. Chapter 3 in your book. Hopefully, we'll get that book to you soon. Focuses on Greece and Persia. All right, so we're starting with this is the region we're going to focus on. Persia is over here, and then Greece is over here. But before Greece became a large civilization, you had two small regions. One was Crete down here; it's this island in the Mediterranean, and then Mycenae. It's a city state, but it was one of the earlier city states that eventually kind of became the foundation for ancient Greece. Crete was a trading state. The city of Crete was known as Knossos. Mycenae is over here. It's just west of Athens and north of Sparta, two cities we're going to talk about in a little bit. Trade with Syria and Crete was very profitable for the Mycenaeans. They also were known for their art. And actually, this is Knossos, by the way. Pretty modern, right? You've got some steps, some stairs. The architecture is pretty modern. So as you can see, these civilizations are really, modernizing quite a bit. So get back to Mycenae. They're known for their art. Here you go. You see some art on pottery. Their artists made jewelry. They also painted frescoes. Frescoes are you kind of see that right here. Early paintings. They were also known for their indoor plumbing, but most importantly, and this is what I would remember, is that the Mycenaeans spread culture, throughout Greece, Asia, and North Africa. So Mycenae is kind of the early great city-state, or the early, early Greek culture is developing. I don't think you have to know either one of them for an exam, but again, these two regions kind of are forming the foundation of Greece and how Greece is going to develop. All right, so let's talk about the city-state. So Greece was really divided into cities. There was never really a single ruler or one large empire. Again, Greece was made up of a series of cities, Athens and Sparta. So most of these states had laws, courts, and armies. These city-states often battled one another, so armies were very important. Greece was polytheistic. The people of Greece, whether it was Athens or Sparta, believed in guardian deities. Temples were very common to house the gods. Again, some of the they were polytheistic, and Zeus. This is Zeus over here. He was the head of the gods, right? If you know the story. There were over 250 city-states in the Greek region. And again, often they were allies, sometimes they were enemies. And there were a number of battles, especially between Greece and Athens, that were pretty bloody and brutal. Greece was patriarchal. Greece was not a place where women saw equal rights. In fact, of all the civilizations we've probably learned about, Greece was the least friendly to women. All free males were citizens, slaves were not, and obviously women were not. So this is a great example of a patriarchal society. All right, so politically, Greek city-states were ruled by one of these 4 types. Some city-states were ruled by a monarch or a king. Some city-states were ruled by a group of nobles known as the aristocracy. You'll see that word a lot throughout our history curriculum. Some were governed by an oligarchy. That's kind of a new term. If you're not familiar with it, I would definitely try to understand it. An oligarchy would be a political group or a government that was run by a few wealthy landowners and merchants. Um, they usually would yield power to a tyrant who represented their wants and their needs. Um, not democratic, but as time would go on, especially Athens, it would become more democratic as time went on, where the people would have more of a say in the government. So again, there was never one single type of political structure. There were four different types, but we do remember Greece for that's where democracy was born. It wasn't always democratic, but the ideas behind democracy do emerge. This is Pericles. We'll learn about Pericles in a second. All right, so a little bit about Sparta. Sparta is probably one of the most famous city-states of Greece. If you've ever seen the movie 300, the Spartans were battling the Persians. Sparta was unique because it was a military society. All men and women at an early age were trained to become proficient in military things. Spartan women not only were trained in the military, but they also ran households. Sparta was unique in that it wasn't as patriarchal as the other city-states. In fact, um, Spartan women probably had more freedom than any other group of women in Greece. They were educated, they could own property, and they did perform in athletic events. So the Spartan women were unique, and not, it wasn't common to Greece to see women that had these rights. Again, most of the Greek city-states were patriarchal. Slaves were common. They were known as shilots. They were farmers, and usually they were captives from war. Sparta was an oligarchy, but there was a time when they also had two kings. So not a democratic society in any sense. It was a tightly controlled society. They did not promote diversity. They limited outside culture and ideas to kind of preserve their traditional ways. All right, Athens. Athens is the most, probably the most influential in terms of the city-states, mostly because of their government structure. So a little background. Early on, Athens was a monarchy, and then it kind of transitioned into an aristocracy. A Solon or wise ruler was usually in charge. But as time went on, the merchant class, kind of an oligarchical group, did start to emerge, and they supported tyrants who then took over from the Solon. And once in power, they lowered taxes, they ended debt, slavery, meaning you couldn't become a slave if you were in debt, and they increased citizen power. So these tyrants actually did make some positive changes. By 500 BC, though, these tyrants were replaced by kings and aristocrats in other city-states, but democracy still continued to grow in Athens. Athens was a direct democracy, not a representative democracy. And what that means is the people of Athens got to vote directly on laws and issues. We are a direct democracy in some sense at the local level, but at the federal level, we don't have a direct say in perhaps the impeachment of a president, the voting on constitutional amendments or other federal laws. So we are more of a representative democracy where we choose men and women to represent us. All right, so Pericles, that was the gentleman who I showed you a little bit ago. He was the probably the most famous ruler of Greece, 461. I believe that's that might be BC or C. I'm not sure. Under his rule, there was a golden age, and that was defined by the Parthenon being rebuilt. The Parthenon is this engineering feat that we'll learn about in a little bit. He was credited, though, with transferring more power to the assembly. Again, a government body, a representative body, and that assembly was also known as the Council of 500. So here we go. We start, we see legislative bodies. Even though the people did vote, there were assemblies that discussed issues and, pretty much just ran the government. Athens also had a court, a people's court, where the people would determine judgments, almost like a jury and a judge combined, right? So the people made these final decisions regarding regarding justice and crimes. All right, as I mentioned before, Athens especially was patriarchal. Women could not participate in government. They couldn't vote. They couldn't own property, unlike Sparta. Unlike in Mesopotamia, they did not receive an education. In fact, upper class women had to be accompanied by a man. So the freedom of women was very limited. They were also considered intellectually inferior to men. So we're kind of looking at a society that did not see women in an intellectual light or on an equal footing. All right, so let's kind of discuss another important aspect of Greece would be their philosophers. And they were known, or Athens was known, for producing some of the great philosophers in history. Socrates was the original philosopher. He taught Plato, and then Plato instructed or guided Aristotle. So let's kind of break each one down and take some notes on each philosopher. Socrates, we have these Socratic seminars. Well, that idea of a Socratic seminar kind of comes from Socrates, and he had a philosophy known as the Socratic method of teaching. And basically it was to encourage his students to ask questions, and by doing that, you'll kind of extend learning, and that's what we try to do in a Socratic seminar, is that when someone asks a question, it might lead to another question and then another question, and that's how we kind of end up getting to answers, right? By continuing the questioning method. It's interesting. He was not. He was kind of seen by the government of Athens well, basically they suspected, or some suspected, that he opposed democracy, and he wasn't the only philosopher to question the idea of a democracy. He did have associations with some in the oligarchy, so he was a target. He was actually brought to trial because it was believed he did not believe in the God system, and it was believed that he was corrupting the youth of Greece with his new methods of education. He was eventually executed in 399 BCE. There he is right over here. All right, so his student Plato was, he, like Socrates, he questioned democracy, mostly because he just didn't believe that perhaps the citizens lacked the intelligence and rational thought to really make government effective and make sound decisions. Even our founding fathers were concerned about that. In fact, the American people did not elect a president directly. The Electoral College was born early on, mostly because Jefferson and Madison didn't believe that the American farmer had the intellect to make a good choice. So you actually elected delegates or representatives to go to Washington and vote for the candidate that they believed was the best candidate. Very indirect. Today, the Electoral College is a little different, but even early on, senators were chosen by state legislators who maybe had some education. Socrates or Plato believed that the ideal society was ruled by a government that did uphold justice and ethics. So they didn't really believe in a tyrant. They just believed in a philosopher king, basically an intellectual, person who could make good decisions for the state. Not a democratic ideology, right? A single king, but that king was wise, that king was ethical, and that king did believe in justice. All right, Aristotle was a student of Plato. His main belief was he encouraged people to avoid extreme behavior. He believed that too much courage was actually not good, that it could lead to mistakes. He was a philosopher that believed in moderation, and he referred to that as the golden mean. He also supported the idea of empiricism, and this is how he influenced science. He believed that to really understand what was happening around you, you had to make observations, learn from those observations, and collect evidence rather than just relying on your intuition or making decisions wholly based on your religious or spiritual beliefs. So he was more of a pragmatist. All right, a little bit about the religion of Greece. As we mentioned, it was polytheistic. Their beliefs were entrenched in the myth, and they used myths to teach ethics and right and wrong. Syncretic means synchronism. Think of synthesizing, and Greek religion actually was combined with ideas from Egypt and Persia, and that's a pretty important piece. You want to be aware of how different cultures combine, right? So here's a great example of the Greeks and Egyptians kind of combining ideas about religion. So try to remember some examples of syncretism. Religious ceremonies were incorporated into the theater, and it was your duty to perform. So, actually, it wasn't necessarily, something that people wanted to do, but they feel that they had to perform in theater. The Olympic Games were, the Olympics were born in Greece. If you don't, this image is actually, this was the Olympic hockey team in 1980. Maybe you've heard of them. It was like the Miracle on Ice. They were not supposed to win the gold medal, but they defeated like a way better hockey team. This was the Russian team. Considered like one of the greatest upsets in sports history. I was 9, and I remember it pretty clearly being just stunned that they won this hockey game against the Russians for the gold medal. The Olympic Games, even today, were designed to are designed to create a sense of unity and patriotism. Back then, they were used to create a common feeling of Greekness and also to show respect for the gods and offerings. So again, that's kind of the idea behind the Olympics. One, to bring countries together and in a peaceful way, but also to again bring the people of a country together. And I remember that hockey game. It was pretty interesting. Americans were pretty bummed out. The Russians were kind of winning the Cold War. The radicals in Islam had taken American hostages, and when we won this, gas prices were crazy. America was in a recession. But when we won this hockey game, it kind of gave Americans something positive to think about, and we were all pretty stoked and psyched. All right, so let's continue with culture in Athens. You've heard of the tragedy and the comedy. Those literary types were born in Athens. Comedy was not ha-ha funny Seinfeld, Friends sitcom. These were performances that focused on character triumphing over hardship. Comedies did contain some satire. Aristophanes is the famous artist who promoted the comedy. And what we want to remember and what we want to continue to or not remember, but take away is that Greek literature influenced Shakespeare. He wrote tragedies and comedies. He was a believer in satire. So again, that's the influence you always want to kind of remember, how the Greeks influenced us. All right, art and architecture is a pretty important concept. The Parthenon is a great example of the developing architecture of the time. It was where the gods were supposed to live. They were known for these really amazing columns with carved friezes. The friezes are up here, kind of basically artwork that stood atop the column, and usually they contain images of the Greek myths. That's the Parthenon. Great piece of evidence to support the concept of architecture and art during this time period. We're going to skip this slide. It's not really too important. I'm going to skip this slide, not too important. Let's start talking about Persia. So we're kind of done with Greece. Um, Persia. Persia is the empire that was west of Greece. This will be the last topic of the day. Today, Persia would make up, mostly Iran. It was also known as the Achaemenid Empire. I don't even know if I pronounced that right. The empire also included Iraq. Basically, it's Mesopotamia and parts of Arabia, Egypt, Turkey. So it was a huge empire, probably the largest and most diverse empire by 500 BCE. The Roman Empire is going to be larger, but at that point in time, the world had never seen such a huge empire. It might be referred to as the Achaemenid, but I just refer to it as the Persian Empire. All right, so the first great leader of the Persian Empire was Cyrus the Great. He created a professional army, about 2.5 million men, so it was a huge army. The Persians were fighting the Spartans in the movie 300, so the Persians were known for their military strength. They took lands from Palestine, which is kind of where Israel is, Babylon, Syria. So he was very successful at conquering territory. But unlike other great leaders, he actually didn't make it. He was killed during a military campaign. Alexander was not killed during a campaign. Napoleon was not killed during a campaign. Caesar, Augustus, but Cyrus the Great was one of those rulers that didn't make it out of the battlefield. Cyrus is also known for building the Royal Road. It was really one of the first great roads that allowed goods to transport throughout this region. It was a paved road, brick and rock. And what it did is it helped unify, like laws unify, so do roads. It brought the empire, or at least people in the empire, closer together. He also developed kind of an early postal system. Basically, he had couriers or messengers that would communicate from one general to another. So it's kind of an earlier form of the postal service. Cyrus was also known for his tolerance and diversity, and that's pretty unique. He allowed conquered people to maintain their local religions, including their statues and their icons. He even made offerings and acknowledged those local gods to kind of, develop closer relationships to those conquered people to earn their trust. And that was how he was able to, get people to, agree to be conquered. They were less resistant when they knew that he wasn't going to destroy their culture. He also returned the goods to those who were conquered by the Babylonians. So he was looking out to kind of develop relationships. He even freed Hebrews who were enslaved in Babylon and allowed them to return home, and he even helped rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. So as far as rulers go, he was, again, very tolerant, very, looking to kind of bring people together, not punish them. He also created the Cyrus cylinder. Wasn't a Bill of Rights, but it's kind of like Hammurabi's Code. And it documented his policies and his relaxation in treatment of conquered peoples. I'll show you an image of that. But it is kind of like Hammurabi's Code. It's a cylinder that has written policies on it. So we see written laws emerging in this empire. All right, his son Darius takes over, and like the Egyptian in Chinese, he justified his rule through the idea of divine right, that God chose him. 552 to 486 BCE, he divided the empire into provinces. And each province had a ruler who represented Darius. So kind of wouldn't say democratic, but representative. The capital of Persia was Persepolis, and government, basically it was a centralized government where all of the decisions, the rule was taking place in this capital. Kind of like, we have Washington, D.C. We have a federal government, a centralized government that kind of runs that country. Greece was not centralized. The Romans did have a centralized government. A satrap was, again, this ruler, this province ruler who represented Darius. So these are some of those, this is bureaucracy, or these are some of those positions that, or people who were working out of the capital. He even hired eyes and ears, and these were men who would spy on the satrap to make sure the satrap was doing his duty or governing correctly. It was a very efficient bureaucracy, and it even had judges, and these judges were judges for life, kind of like our Supreme Court judges. And here's a sculpture of Darius. Darius also implemented taxing. The Romans would implement this as well to fund projects, to build Persepolis, to maintain the royal road and maintain the postal system. And Darius also implemented or started to build inns and markets. These were known as caravanserai, not sure. But basically, along this royal road, markets and inns were set up as rest stops. Kind of the the early version of the Jersey Turnpike rest stop. He also initiates or develops a common currency, and this leads to economic prosperity. And also, common currency is going to, again, help unite a nation, right? Everyone has the same currency, they're speaking the same language, they follow the same religion. It's about unifying a group of people. And this is Persepolis. Again, very modern looking city with some architecture that's fairly unique, steps, bridges, columns. All right, so by the way, this is the Cyrus cylinder, and this is where Cyrus outlined his diversity beliefs and his ideas on religious tolerance. So I think this is a really important concept. And if you're going to remember one thing about Persia, remember that it was a very tolerant empire of different cultures and different religions. And again, it was outlined on the Cyrus cylinder. The one thing was, though, you could pray, you could do whatever you wanted in that region, but if you were, you still had to pay taxes and fight if you wanted to maintain your culture. There was a caveat there, or a compromise, or a catch. All right, so early on, Persia was polytheistic, but over time it would become monotheistic. And the early monotheism, or the first monotheistic religion, was called Zoroastrianism. And basically, it was this belief in a god named Ahura Mazda. I guess that's Mazda, maybe the same Mazda, or that's why Mazda is named Mazda. So it's monotheism, but it was known as Zoroastrianism. Definitely remember that. Again, early monotheism that shapes Judaism and Christianity later on. Also, the people of Persia believed that there was a god of darkness, and that this god of darkness and others were not to be worshipped. Zoroastrianism also taught concepts of heaven and hell. Again, foundations for Judaism and Christianity. And the ideas of Zoroastrianism were outlined in the Avestas, written texts to help spread religion. Kind of like the Upanishad texts, the Old Testament, and later the New Testament. So here are some good examples of religion being documented, and then eventually that allowing or helping religion to be spread, right? When it's written down, it's passed on from place to place. So the Avestas. I would actually underline that if I were you. I think that's pretty important. All right, so Persian society, slavery, like Athens and Sparta. Slaves were farmers, they were servants, they built the roads, the irrigation systems. Women could own and manage property, so the Persians were a little more open-minded than the Athenians. They could even earn wages through trade. Divorce was possible, but it's still considered a patriarchal society because women did not have any political power. They didn't have a voice in government. So anytime you have, a society where women aren't voting, that's patriarchal. So I guess you could say the United States was pretty patriarchal until 1920, and I would agree with that. Women didn't vote until 1920, and so until then, we were patriarchal. The economy of Persia, trade was very important. Traders would bring ivory into Turkey, wool from Phoenicia, wine from Greece, and grain and textiles from Egypt. The Persians, like the Mesopotamians, were growing wheat and barley. They had domesticated animals like cattle, sheep. So that's probably what was being traded back and forth. They were also known for some more advanced irrigation systems, and these were known as qanats. Here's a qanat. And basically, these are underground canals. Um, the Royal Road obviously was very important to that trade, and sea trade was also important. Persia was near the Mediterranean. Um, the Persian Empire was, obviously in parts of Arabia, so it was not difficult to kind of get from one place to another by boat, and that really helped the economy grow. All right, so we're almost done. Alexander the Great, like Darius, he was considered a great ruler, I guess. Alexander and his father Philip were not from Athens or Greece. They were from a region north of Greece called Macedon. It too was an empire from 359 to 323. Um, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time with Philip. Philip was kind of the father, but Alexander is the ruler we want to focus on. He was a great military leader. Um, he defeated the Persians and basically took over the Persian Empire in 331 BC. And this was his empire. Again, incredibly large empire, equal to the Persian Empire because he took over most of Persia. Here's Mesopotamia, modern day Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Egypt. And here's where he was from, Macedonia. Very not a huge region, but look at what he did with that military power. So Alexander's empire was very large. So what he did is he actually recruited 3 generals to run it. You really don't have to know much about this, but just some background. His first general was Ptolemy. He ran and governed Egypt. Antigonus ran and governed Greece and Macedon. Seleucus governed Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean coast. So he kind of, didn't micromanage his empire. He had 3 men who helped govern it for him. He led troops as far as Egypt and as north as India. So, very popular leader. Very, his generals and his soldiers are very loyal to Alexander. And here's his empire again. Again, a massive empire. India, Egypt, and obviously Greece. All right, so why do we need to kind of remember Alexander? He was tolerant. He allowed Persians in Persia to run that empire. He kind of conquered it, but he gave the Persians a lot of autonomy. He also encouraged his generals to marry Persian women to strengthen relations with the Persian people. So he was someone who did promote toleration and diversity. He founded the city of Alexandria, which still exists today. This is an old lighthouse that's no longer there, but it's a pretty amazing engineering feat for that time to build something like that. Alexandria was the center of Hellenistic culture, and that's an important term to remember. Really simple. Greek culture or Hellenistic culture spread to Egypt because Alexander brought it there. Alexandria became a place where Greek works were stored in libraries, Greek artifacts were stored in museums, and Alexandria became a center of learning for scholars who would study the Greek philosophers, or at least their writings. So Alexander is bringing Greek culture to the Middle East. and preserving it in libraries and museums. Again, this is known as the Hellenistic period. Again, Alexander's rule, spreading Greek culture, language, architecture, mythology, and philosophy. The transfer, the spread of Hellenistic culture, or just the Hellenistic period. Um, and we know that Greek culture spread east because archaeologists have discovered Greco or Greek and Buddhist art in South Asia. This is in India, and here we have Greek people performing, drinking. We see, vases. So this is not found in Greece or Rome. This is found in India. Um, Buddhas or Buddha statues have been discovered in Asia wearing Greek clothing. So again, there's that influence of Hellenistic culture or Greek culture spreading as far as India, and that's Alexander bringing it with him. And I didn't mention this theater. A theater was found in Afghanistan. The idea of performing spread up into the northern part of Alexander's empire, which again today would be Afghanistan. All right, so let's talk about cultural absorption. Kind of like syncretism, same idea. This idea that Greek culture would be absorbed by Persian culture. Actually, Persian or Alexander adopted Persian traditions and practices. Not only was he tolerant of them, he basically liked a lot of their culture, and he and his people would wear Persian clothing. They would use Persian language and Persian language format when it came to making government orders, and he adopted similar Persian tax systems and military methods. So Alexander was not someone who blew off or ignored other cultures. He embraced those cultures, and for that we kind of give him credit for. All right, so eventually, like every empire, it falls. He didn't do a great job designating an heir, so those who came after him didn't govern effectively. Generals fought to establish their own kingdoms. They didn't get along. And eventually his empire would be replaced or taken over by the Romans. The Romans would adopt Greek culture and further that culture and preserve that culture. But unfortunately, the Romans didn't really appreciate the people of Alexander, and teachers and doctors from this empire were actually enslaved. So, again, the Romans were not as tolerant of conquered people. All right, so just to cover two more slides. How was Greece and Persia similar and different? We see syncretism, where Alexander adopts Persian culture, their government, currency. We know that Zoroastrianism combines Greek language and literature. So there's a good example of, again, this idea of different cultures coming together, or one society borrowing from another. Both Persia and Greece helped shape the Roman Empire. That's important. Both Greece and Persia allowed women few rights, even though we did say Persia. I think Persia, actually, I think women had more rights in Persia than Greece. So I think it was more different than it was similar. The Persians were monotheistic. The Greeks were not. They were polytheistic. Persians were obviously much more tolerant of other peoples. The Greeks had many rulers, where the Persians always had a single ruler like Cyrus or Darius. And the Greeks were never united politically. It was considered an empire, but it was a disjointed empire. And again, those city-states would always fight one another. But there was cultural unity in Greece because of the Olympic Games. So, but Persia, for the most part, was again very united under a centralized government. But there was some unity in Greece, again, brought about by those Olympic Games and their religious traditions. So, I would probably say Persia was more unified, but the Greeks did have some cultural unity. All right, guys, so that's it. We're going to kind of work on China next week.